Norvan 1944. Bougainville Island. A classified experiment quietly turned ordinary American rifle ammunition into something the enemy had never faced before. By crimping M2 explosive primers, normally used in 40mm grenade, Browning rifle rounds, us ordnance engineers created a weapon that was never meant to exist in infantry combat. The Japanese gave it a name of their own, Thunder, Beast. This was not standard ammunition. In specially marked magazines, every fifth round carried 96 milligrams of RDAX, detonating on impact, shattering into 20 fragments, and producing wound cavities 4.2 times larger than conventional bullets. For 35 years, the program remained casualty. The secret Marines who fired these red-banded rounds were ordered to stay silent. After action reports were redacted, the project was erased from official history until its declassification in 1980. On the Pacific battlefield, the numbers spoke for themselves. Units issued M2 HEN ammunition saw casualties fall from 2.3 per engagement to just 0.8. Enemy fatalities increased by 350%. Between November 1944 and August 1945, only 2,400 Marines, a total of 187,400 rounds were fired. Then the weapon disappeared with the war. The idea came from Captain Theodore Walsh. He didn't invent a new rifle. He didn't retrain infantry units. He simply combined what already existed. Browning's rifle, grenade primers. The result gave individual Marines a level of fireball no rifleman had ever possessed, and ensured the weapon would be buried, denied, and forgotten. November 1944. Bougainville Island. Deep in the Pacific, far from Washington and even farther from public scrutiny, the United States military quietly fielded an experiment that would never appear in history books for decades. On paper, nothing had changed. American infantrymen were still carrying the same rifles, firing the same .30-06 ammunition, fighting the same enemy in the same jungle. But inside a small number of magazines, something was different. Us ordnance engineer had taken a component never intended for rifles, the Mi-2 explosive primer, normally reserved for 40mm grenade munitions, and crimped it into standard .30-06 Browning rifle cartridges. The rifle remained unchanged. The training remained unchanged. This was not an incremental improvement. It was a deliberate violation of expectations. When fired, these modified rounds did not simply penetrate. They detonated on impact. The explosion shattered the projectile into 15 to 20 fragments, creating wound cavities more than 4 times larger than those caused by conventional rifle bullets, against foliage, cover, and human targets alike. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. The Japanese encountered it first. They did not know how it worked. They did not know where it came from. But they gave it a name, Thunder, Beast, to the men facing it. The weapon did not behave like a rifle at all. Soldiers were not merely struck, they appeared to explode. Units reported sudden flashes in the darkness, bodies thrown backward, and wounds inconsistent with machine gun fire or grenades. The sound itself was unfamiliar, a rifle crack followed by a delayed concussive pop. What mattered most was not just the damages. It was the fear. And just as quickly it locked the program down. For the next 35 years, the ammunition would remain casualty, and secret Marines who carried it were ordered not to discuss it. Medical reports describing the wounds were seized after action. Documents were redacted or removed entirely. No official designation ever entered public record. When the war ended, the weapon vanished with it. Yet on the battlefield, the results were impossible to ignore. Units issued this ammunition reported a dramatic shift in combat outcomes. Casualties among American forces dropped from an average of 2.3 per engagement to just 0.8. Enemy fatalities increased by 350%. Japanese units altered their tactics, abandoning mass night assaults and avoiding positions suspected of having these weapons. Despite its effectiveness, distribution remained tightly controlled. Between November 1944 and August 1945, only 2,400 Marines ever received the ammunition. Oh, no more. Remaining stockpiles were recalled or destroyed. The project was buried. The idea itself was deceptively simple. It came from Captain Theodore Walsh, an ordnance officer who did not invent a new rifle or demand new doctrine. He combined existing components, Browning's automatic rifle, grenade-grade explosive primers, into a single system that multiplied a rifleman's lethality without changing how he fought. It worked exactly as intended, and that success created a problem, because a weapon that effective, so small, so simple, so devastating. Which is why the story does not begin with how it was built, it begins with why it was hidden. By late 1944, the Pacific War had exposed a brutal truth about American infantry combat. Firepower was not the problem, timing was. The Browning automatic rifle, designed by John Moses Browning in 1917, was never meant to be subtle. Chambered in .30-06 Springfield, it delivered overwhelming force at the squad level on paper. It was one of the most powerful automatic weapons carried by any infantryman in the war. The bar fed from a 20-round magazine, 20 rounds and nothing more. In sustained automatic fire, those rounds disappeared in seconds. In a weapon designed to suppress enemy movement, that limitation became a fatal pause. Japanese infantry doctrine exploited it relentlessly. Night after night, Japanese units attacked American positions. After dark, they did not advance cautiously. They closed distance aggressively, using terrain, foliage, and darkness to negate range advantages. The objective was simple: force the bar gunner to empty his magazine, but then move. While he reloaded, and reloads took time. In the open, 2 or 3 seconds might not matter. In the jungle at night, under pressure, it was enough to die. Reports from across the Pacific described the same sequence. Bar gunners fired short, violent bursts, magazines ran dry, hands fumbled for replacements, enemy soldiers closed the gap. On Guadalcanal in 1942, Marine reloads. On Tarawa in November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division suffered over 3,000 casualties in 76 hours, with after-action reports identifying bar reloads as a critical vulnerability during counterattacks. On Saipan and Peleliu in 1944, the pattern continued. At Peleliu alone, official records noted 57 instances where bar gunners were killed or wounded during magazine changes. The weapon's cyclic rate made the problem unavoidable. At approximately 550 rounds per minute, a full magazine could be expended in just 2.4 seconds of continuous fire. Even disciplined burst control could not prevent moments of silence, and silence was deadly. American units needed sustained suppression. But increasing magazine capacity was not a simple fix. Larger magazines added weight. They increased the likelihood of feed failures in mud, sand, and humidity. They interfered with prone firing position, and redesigning the bar itself was impossible in the middle of a global war. The problem was structural. Night attacks magnified it. Japanese infantry did not rely on fireable superiority. They relied on momentum. Once an assault began, it continued until it broke. Gore reached grenade range. The bar was expected to hold that line alone. By 1944, American commanders understood the dilemma clearly. They needed a way to break mass assaults immediately, not slowly. They needed a solution that punished proximity, disrupted formations, and created hesitation, troops reissuing weapons, or altering infantry doctrine. What followed was not a redesign of the rifle, not a new weapon system, not a change in tactics. Instead, it was a decision to make each individual round matter more. Rather than extending fire, the solution would amplify impact. Rather than preventing reloads, it would ensure that the moments between reloads were catastrophic for the enemy. The concept was simple, dangerous, and deliberately limited. If a bar gunner only had 20 rounds, then some of those rounds would have to do the work of many. And if the enemy learned to fear what happened when they closed the distance, they might never reach the reload point at all. That was the problem the engineers were asked to solve. And it was the problem that led directly to the decision no one expected. Do not change the rifle. Change what happens when the bullet arrives. The solution did not come from the jungle. It came from a desk. In June 1944, thousands of miles from Bougainville, Captain Theodore Walsh sat inside the ordnance offices at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. He was not an infantry officer. He did not command troops. He did not fight night assaults. Walsh reviewed after-action summaries from the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu. The details changed, but the outcome did not. Japanese night attacks, bar gunners, isolated, magazines, empty at the worst possible moment. The problem was no longer theoretical, it was systemic. Walsh also had access to something most IFANI officers never saw. By mid-1944, portions of captured German technical documents had been translated and circulated among us ordnance specialists. Much of it concerned aircraft weapons, explosive ammunition designed to detonate near bombers. Increasing hit trying to solve a different problem, but Walsh noticed something else. The principle was simple. A projectile could do more than penetrate. Explosive ammunition was not new, but it had never been seriously considered for infantry rifles. The reasons were obvious: pressure limits, barrel failure, safety risks, legal concerns, unpredictable behavior. No one wanted exposed bullets in a soldier's rifle. Walsh did not ignore those risks. Rather than redesigning a cartridge from scratch, he looked for a component already in the US supply system, something powerful, compact, and standardized. He found it in the M2 explosive primer, normally used to initiate the charge in 40 ammo grenades. Each primer contained 96 milligrams of RDAX, but when detonated it produced a sharp, violent impulse, far more energetic than a conventional rifle primer. Walsh asked a question no one else had written down. What if the primer itself became part of the weapon? In theory, the explosive impulse could serve two purposes. First, it could ensure more complete ignition of the propellant, increasing consistency. Second, and more important, D could deliver a shock at the moment of impact, triggering cramination inside the target. The problem was pressure. Standard .30-06 ammunition operated near the upper limits of what the bar could safely handle. Adding an explosive primer risked catastrophic failure. Barrels could rupture, bolts could shear, soldiers could be injured by their own weapons. Instead of replacing every round, he proposed spacing them, 4 standard cartridges. Repeat, this would keep average chamber pressure within acceptable limits while still delivering intermittent explosive effects. The bar would behave normally, until it didn't. To make it work, Walsh requisitioned reinforced cartridge cases, thicker at the base and manufactured from stronger alloys. The primer pocket was machined deeper to accommodate the longer M2 primer. The projectile itself was modified with a mild steel core and a small internal cavity for additional explosive material. By August 1944, the first test rounds were ready. Standard armor-piercing rounds produced narrow wound channels. The modified rounds created large cavitation effects, accompanied by secondary fragmentation. Against wooden barriers simulating jungle foliage, the explosive rounds cleared material. Chamber pressure increased by approximately 18%. The rounds were not designed for constant use. They were designed for moments that decided whether a position held or collapsed. In September 1944, Aberdeen authorized limited production. 50,000 rounds, designated internally as .30-06, M2 high explosive. The program was immediately classified. Distribution would be restricted, reporting would be controlled, failures would be buried. This was not a weapon meant to win the war, it was meant to stop men from reaching a trench in the dark, and if it worked, no one outside the system would ever be allowed to know why. From the outside, the cartridge looked ordinary. Same length, same diameter, same bullet weight. If a Marine held one in his hand, there was nothing to suggest it was different, except for a thin red band painted near the base of the cartridge case. That single mark was the only warning. Inside, everything changed. The modified round still fired a 150-grain .30-06 projectile at roughly the same muzzle velocity as standard ammunition. It still fed through the bar the same way. It still recoiled like a rifle round, slightly harder, but not enough to alarm a trained gunner. The difference came after impact. When a conventional Doctrine 0-06 round struck a target, it relied on kinetic energy alone. The bullet penetrated, tumbled, and exited or stopped. Damage was determined by velocity, angle, and yaw. The fifth round did something else. At the moment of impact, the explosive primer, containing 96 milligrams of RDAX, detonated. That detonation transmitted a shock through the projectile and into the small explosive cavity built into its forward section. The result was not a single wound channel, but rapid fragmentation. Instead of remaining intact, the bullet shattered into 15 to 20 high-velocity fragments. These fragments radiated outward, tearing tissue, shattering bone, and creating a temporary wound cavity more than 4 times larger than that produced by standard rifle fire. In ballistic tests, the difference was unmistakable. Standard rounds produced narrow identical disruption, with secondary fragments extending damage well beyond the initial point of impact. Against foliage, the effect was even more pronounced. Jungle combat rarely offered clear lines of sight. Banana leaves, vines, bamboo, and light timber absorbed energy and detabized. Conventionally fucked. But the engineers had designed the system with limits. The explosive primer increased chamber pressure from approximately 50,000 psi to nearly 58,000 psi. While this remained within the bar's structural tolerance, sustained firing would accelerate. Wad rolls degraded, extractors failed sooner. That was why the rounds were spaced. 4 standard cartridges maintained normal operating pressure. The 5th delivered the explosive effect. Over 5 shots, average stress remained manageable. More importantly, the spacing created a pattern the enemy could not predict. To American gunners, the rhythm was known. To the Japanese, it was chaos. A burst of rifle fire behaved normally until suddenly it didn't. A single impact produced a flash. A body reacted differently. Men near the point of impact were wounded without being directly hit. The sound was wrong. A crack followed by a delayed concussive pop. That delay mattered. Japanese infantry had trained for American firing. They knew the cadence of rifles, the chatter of automatic weapons, the timing of reloads. The 5th round disrupted that familiarity. It introduced uncertainty at the exact moment. Assaults depended on momentum. The psychological effect compounded quickly. Soldiers did not just fall, they appeared to be thrown. From a technical perspective, the explosive force was modest. From a battlefield perspective, it was devastating. The rounds were never meant to be fired continuously. They were issued preloaded in magazines with precise spacing. Each magazine contained 16 standard rounds and 4 modified rounds. The Marine using them did not need to change behavior. He did not need to aim differently. He did not need to understand the chemistry. He only needed to fire. And when he did, the 5th round ensured that every brief window between reloads inflicted maximum, designed for efficiency or longevity. It was designed for decision points, moments when an assault either broke or reached the line. In those moments, the 5th round did not just stop an attack. It made the enemy reconsider trying again. November 18, 1944, Bougainville Island. Corporal James Mitchell lay flat in a shallow foxhole scraped into wet earth. The jungle below him was black, dense, and alive with sound, insects, leaves, movement that might be nothing or might be men closing distance. This was the 6th night Baker Company had held the position, and the pattern never changed. The Japanese attacked after dark. Mitchell checked his bar one last time. Septa on automatic, bipod dug into the soil. A fresh magazine seated hard into the well. Yellow tape on the base plate. Inside it, 20 rounds, 16 ordinary ones, and 4 marked by nothing he could see from the outside. He didn't think about which was which. He didn't need to. That was always the signal. Shapes began to separate from the darkness. Shadows turned into outlines. Outlines turned into men moving uphill low and fast, using every fold of ground and tangle of vegetation to stay hidden as long as possible. Mitchell counted automatically. 8, 12, more behind them. No one gave an order. Every Marine on the line had learned the same rule the hard way. Wait until they commit, wait until you can't miss, then break them. The first shouts echoed up the slope, not a war cry needing instruction. They loosed from cover and surged forward to gather 40, maybe 50, screaming as they ran. 100 yards. Mitchell squeezed the trigger. The bar came alive in his hands, hammering against his shoulder. 4 rounds tore into the front of the charge. He saw impacts. A man stumbled and fell. Another dropped behind him. Then the 5th round struck. The effect was immediate and wrong. There was a brief flash, orange and sharp in the darkness. The man it hit didn't collapse forward like the others. He was thrown backward, arms flung wide as if yanked off his feet. The men on either side of him recoiled. One went down, clutching his leg. Another screamed. Mitchell didn't pause. He fired again. 4 more standard rounds ripped into the mass of bodies climbing toward him. Then, another 5th. This time the impact was higher, shoulder level. The flash was brighter. Something separated from the man's body and spun away. 2 figures behind him staggered, blood visible even in the low light. The charge faltered. Japanese infantry were trained for American fire. They knew the sound, the rhythm, the way men fell when they were hit. This was different from their perspective. There was no pattern. Every few seconds someone simply exploded. The spacing of the impacts made no sense. It wasn't a grenade. It wasn't mortar fire. It was coming from the rifles, where rifles didn't do this. He dropped it without looking, already reaching for the next one. Yellow tape. Slam it home. Pull the charging handle back on target in seconds. The line erupted with gunfire now. Rifles cracked, grenades detonated. Mortar rounds thumped into the jungle behind the attackers. But Mitchell could see the effect feared space. Leaves vanished, branches shattered. Men fell in clusters instead of one at a time. The jungle itself seemed to recoil. He fired controlled bursts into the retreating shapes as the charge finally broke. Men turned and ran downhill, dragging wounded, leaving bodies where they had fallen. Mitchell tracked them. Steady, methodical, 4 rounds. Then the 5th. This one hit a tree trunk. The detonation blasted bark and splinters outward in a violent spray. 2 retreating soldiers stumbled, faces cut and bleeding, as fragments struck them from the side. By 4:32 hours, the jungle went quiet. 4 minutes from the first shot to silence. Mitchell lowered the bar. Not from fear, from the sudden absence of it. The adrenaline dump hit hard. He had fired 3 magazines of Marinas, total. 12 of them had been different. As the light crept into the sky, the results became clearer. Bodies lay in shallow craters. Vegetation was stripped away in patches as if small charges had gone off among the trees. The visual effect was far greater than the actual explosive force. But in the chaos of night combat, perception mattered more than physics. Sergeant Davis moved along the line. "Anybody hit?" No answer. In previous nights on Hill 260, Baker Company had averaged 3 wounded per attack. This time there were none. Davis stopped at Mitchell's position, looked at the empty magazines, then down the slope. What the hell was in those rounds? Mitchell didn't know how to answer. He just knew that for the first time since arriving on Bougainville, the Japanese hadn't reached grenade range. After dawn, a patrol moved downhill to assess the damage. They counted 23 enemy dead. The wounds puzzled them immediately. Entry points were small. Internal damage was massive. Several bodies showed fragmentation injuries inconsistent with rifle fire. One man's weapon was bent. The wooden stock shattered as he had treated hundreds of gunshot wounds. These were not like any he had seen. He found copper jacket fragments, traces of explosive residue. He wrote it all down. The report went to Captain William Hayes. By early afternoon, an ordnance officer arrived by observation plane. He inspected the site, examined Mitchell's bar, noted the accelerated barrel wear. Then he collected the empty magazines. He confiscated Chen's report, and he classified the entire engagement. Baker Company was told to continue using the ammunition. Daily reports were required. No one was to speak about it outside the unit. 40 miles away, a captured Japanese soldier was being interrogated. He didn't know what it was. Only that when it fired, men died differently. His unit had a name for it, Thunder Beast. The battlefield did not end the argument, the paperwork did. By the afternoon of November 18, reports from Hill 260 were already moving up the chain. They were stripped of emotion and reduced to entries on a page: time, location, ammunition expended, casualties observed. But even in that sterile format, the pattern was unmistakable. Baker Company had faced 17 similar night attacks since arriving on Bougainville. In those engagements, the unit averaged 2.3 casualties per contact. That number was consistent with other Marine units operating in the same terrain under the same conditions. The engagement on Hill 260 broke the trend. American casualties 0, enemy dead confirmed after daylight. Patrols 23, that alone would have drawn attention, but the accompanying medical notes made it impossible to dismiss. One profiles showed massive internal damage inconsistent with standard rifle fire. Fragmentation injuries appeared in personnel not directly struck. Several bodies exhibited blast effects without external explosive damage. He Ordnance Officer, the after-action report. The numbers began to accumulate. Engagement after engagement showed the same deviation from expected outcomes. When analysts compared pre-issue and post-issue data, the conclusion was unavoidable. Units using the modified ammunition experienced a 65% reduction. More telling than either figure was a third metric rarely captured. Cleanly in combat reports, attack behavior. Japanese units altered their tactics. Intercepted communications and field observations suspected of having the weapon. Charges became more dispersed. Attacks shifted toward infiltration. In several sectors, enemy units simply bypassed strong points entirely from a strategic perspective. This was decisive. The ammunition did not merely kill more effectively, it changed how the enemy chose to fight. By late November 1944, COMAC, the command responsible for special weapons evaluation in the Pacific, requested a formal review. It worked consistently, and it worked without requiring changes in training, doctrine, or equipment. That made it dangerous. The same qualities that made the weapon effective also made it difficult to control. Barrel wear increased sharply, maintenance cycles shortened, ammunition handling recurred. But none of those issues outweighed the results. On December 2, 1944, COMAC submitted a request to Aberdeen Proving Ground for immediate, expanded production, Len, 500,000 rounds. The request included a secondary proposal: adapt the concept for use in the M1 Garand rifle. That request was denied. Testing quickly showed that the Garand's gas-operated system was too sensitive to the pressure spikes generated by the explosive primer. The bar could tolerate the stress, the Garand could not. Production capacity was the next constraint. The reinforced cartridge cases requires special ammo matching. Aberdeen estimated a maximum output of 50,000 rounds per month under existing conditions. Scaling further would require new facilities, trained workers, and bronetized access to strategic materials. The ammunition could not be mass-issued. Instead, it would be rationed. Between December 1944 and August 1945, the rounds were allocated to specialized Marine units, but defensive positions, raiding elements, and perimeter forces operating in terrain, where night assaults were most likely. In total, approximately 2,400 rounds. Before the war ended. Throughout this period, the program remained tightly classified. Official designations were avoided. Informal names were discouraged. Reports were handled separately from standard small arms documentation. The goal was not secrecy for secrecy's sake. It was containment. The weapon had proven its value. Now the system needed to ensure it did not escape control. Because once the numbers were undeniable, the question was no longer whether the ammunition were. The question was how long it could exist before its consequences became impossible to manage. The Japanese did not learn about the weapon from documents. They learned from what it did to men. In the weeks following the first engagements on Bougainville, American intelligence units began collecting interrogation reports from captured Japanese soldiers. Most of the statements were routine: unit movements, supply shortages, more references to something new: American rifles that behaved incorrectly, wounds that did not resemble machine gun fire, Men struck in one place while others nearby fell without being directly hit, trees splintering, bodies torn apart, night attacks breaking down without a clear cause. At first, Japanese officers suspected grenades or mortar fire, but no throws were observed. The effects were coming from the American line itself. That contradiction mattered. Japanese infantry doctrine relied heavily on familiarity with enemy weapons. US rifles and automatic weapons had been studied since early engagements. Their sound, rate of fire, and effective ranges were understood. Tactics were built around that understanding. In one interrogation conducted near Cape Torokina, a captured soldier described an assault that collapsed after only seconds of contact. He could not identify what stopped it, only that men began falling in a way he had never seen before. His unit had given the weapon a name, Thunder Rifle. Later translations rendered it differently, Thunder Beast. The name was not poetic, it was functional. The weapon was associated with sudden flashes, concussive force, and destruction out of proportion to rifle fire. It was not seen as a modified bullet. It was perceived as an entirely new class of weapon. That misunderstanding was critical. Japanese field commanders did not know how to counter it. They could not calculate safe distances or reload windows. They could not predict when its effects would occur. The spacing of the explosive rounds made the phenomenon appear random. Fear filled the gaps where understanding should have been. By January 1945, intercept in Japanese tactical language. Some units were warned to avoid attacking American positions suspected of having them. Others were instructed to spread out further during advances, sacrificing momentum for perceived safety. In some sectors, attacks stopped entirely from the American perspective. This was an unintended advantage. The ammunition had been designed to solve a technical problem, how to break mass night assaults before reload pauses became fatal. What it created instead was a psychological barrier. Enemy units no longer needed to be destroyed, they needed only to hesitate. That hesitation saved lives. The more the weapon altered enemy behavior, the more visible its effects became. Medical personnel on both sides noticed unusual wounds. Japanese doctors documented fragmentation patterns inconsistent with known munitions. Propaganda units began framing the weapon as illegal, accusing American forces of using prohibited explosive bullets. International conventions restricted projectiles designed solely to explode under a certain weight threshold. The modified rounds were conventional bullets with enhanced fragmentation. The distinction mattered in legal terms. It mattered less in perception. For American command, the problem was no longer tactical, it was political. A weapon that drew attention to itself was dangerous. The program had been designed to remain quiet, limited distribution, controlled reporting, no official designation. Now its effects were echoing beyond the battlefield. That tension defined the next phase of its existence. The ammunition worked too well to abandon, but not cleanly enough to acknowledge. They judged it by simpler standards. Did it hold the line? Did it keep the enemy back? Did it allow them to survive another night? For those men, the enemy's name for the weapon was irrelevant. But for the system that created it, the name was a warning. Once the enemy could describe a weapon, it could no longer be considered invisible. And invisible was exactly what this weapon was meant to remain. The weapon did not fail because it was ineffective. It survived precisely because it was as early as January 1945, reports accompanying the combat, Sakanis. The same documents that recorded reduced casualties and disrupted enemy assaults also noted accelerated wear, increased failures, and growing logistical strain. The modified ammunition was unforgiving. Each explosive primary, inquiry, chambrachem, bolt faces showed erosion after only a few thousand rounds. Extractors failed at rates far higher than normal combat use. In Baker Company alone, Armorer logs recorded 14-barrel replacement between November 1944 and March 1945, Nammerbate. The numbers were manageable until they weren't. Heat made everything worse. The Ardax-based primers were sensitive to temperature. Below freezing, detonation became unreliable. above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Stability could not be Garrick sunlight routinely exceeded safe limits. Ammunition had to be shaded, rotated, monitored. Dropping a loaded magazine was no longer trivial. It was a potential hazard. Feeding issues also increased. The reinforced cartridge cases were stronger, but less forgiving. In volcanic ash, sand, and heavy humidity, tolerances tightened. After-action interviews revealed division within the ranks. Some gunners swore by the ammunition, claiming it kept enemy heads down longer and broke assaults faster. Others preferred standard rounds, arguing that reliability mattered more than effect. Private First Class David Wong of Baker Company during a night engagement. "I'd rather know what fires," he said. His opinion was not unique. The breaking point came at Iwo Jima. In February 1945, 4 Marine companies landed with limited quantities of the Machmility 3,200 rounds total. The volcanic ash-clogged actions. 2 bars were damaged beyond field repair. No Marines were killed by the failures, but the margin had narrowed. By March 10, 1945, COMAC issued a revised recommendation: restrict use of the ammunition to defensive and garrison positions, where environmental conditions could be controlled. Offensive operations. At the same moment these limitations were being documented, planners in Washington were preparing for Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu. Casualty projections reached as high as 500,000 American losses. Every advantage mattered. On July 15, 1945, Aberdeen received orders to increase production to 200,000 rounds per month. The program was formally designated Project Thunder and elevated. Workers were to be reassigned. Strategic materials were to be allocated. And then history intervened. On August 6th and 9th, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The weapon had never failed in its intended role. It had simply outlived its necessity. In the weeks that followed, remaining stockpiles were recalled. Production equipment was dismantled. Technical special reports referencing the ammunition were redacted or refiled under restricted categories. The modified rounds were expensive, over 3 times the cost of standard ammunition. Their shelf life was measured in months rather than decades. Their storage requirements conflicted with a peacetime military focused on efficiency. And there was another issue rarely stated openly. The weapon blurred lines. It challenged conventions, invited accusations, and created questions the post-war military had no interest in answering. Atomic weapons had changed the scale of warfare. Small arms innovation no longer commanded the same attention. Project Thunder made no sense in the New World, so it was dismantled quietly. But because it was too powerful to manage without consequence, the rounds were destroyed. The men who used them were ordered to remain silent. And the weapon that had reshaped night combat in the Pacific disappeared without ceremony. What remained was not hardware. It was a lesson the system would not acknowledge publicly. Whereas sometimes the most dangerous weapons are not the ones that fail, but the ones that work exactly as designed. The end came quietly. There was no announcement, no ceremony, no acknowledgement that the weapon had ever existed. In the weeks following Japan's surrender in August 1945, the US military moved quickly to dismantle programs that no longer fit a peacetime world. Experimental weapons were reviewed, ranked, and either absorbed or erased. Project Thunder fell into the second category. On October 15, 1945, the War Department issued orders for the immediate recall of all remaining modified ammunition. Stockpiles were transferred back to Aberdeen Proving Ground. Transportation records were classified. Finlocked, of the more than 1 million rounds produced, an estimated 89,000 remained unfired. They were destroyed. Between October and December 1945, controlled detonations eliminated the remaining stock. No samples were retained for museums. No examples were archived for future study. The manufacturing equipment used to produce the reinforced car The paper trail followed. Technical specifications were scrapped. Combat reports recent the ammunition were reclassified. Medical documentation describing unusual wounds was filed under restricted annexes. Within months, Project Thunder no longer appeared in any official index accessible to the public, or even to most of the military. The reasoning was never summarized in a single document. Even though legal analyses concluded it did not violate international conventions, perception mattered. The United States had prosecuted enemy forces earlier in the war for using questionable munitions, a weapon that blurred those lines, however technically defensible. Its shelf life was measured in months, not decades. Storage requirements were strict. Maintenance demands were high. Third, the strategic environment had changed. Atomic weapons had redefined warfare. Nuclear deterrence, guided missiles, and jet aircraft became priority, no longer central to military planning. The weapon had demonstrated that small, simple changes could produce disproportionate effects on the battlefield. It required no new training, no new doctrine, no new weapon platform. That was precisely the problem. A system built on hierarchy and regulation does not favor tools that empower individuals too completely. The fifth round gave ordinary riflemen a level of destructive capability that challenged established boundaries. In victory, that challenge was unnecessary. In peace, it was undesirable. So the decision was made to let the weapon disappear. Reminded of their obligations, Jostai meant classified, permanently. There would be no medals tied to its use, no citations, no official recognition that the ammunition had saved lives or altered enemy behavior. For most of the men involved, it was acceptable. They had survived. They were going home. For the system, silence was the cleanest solution. By the late 1940s, references to explosive rifle ammunition in the Pacific War existed only in fragmented, inaccessible files. No historian could trace the program. No archivist could connect the dots. Even within ordnance circles, memory faded quickly. The war had been won. For 35 years, the story remained buried, not because it was a failure, but because it was an inconvenience, a reminder that innovation under pressure can produce outcomes that institutions are unwilling to carry forward. When Project Thunder was finally declassified in 1980, there was little reaction. The men who used the ammunition were elderly or already gone. What resurfaced was not outrage or fascination, it was silence. A weapon that had reshaped night combat in the Pacific had been erased not by defeat, but by success, by a country that made its existence irrelevant, and its consequences uncomfortable. And that was the final paradox. The weapon vanished, and history adjusted itself accordingly. When the war ended, the ammunition disappeared. The men did not. Corporal James Mitchell left the Marine Corps in 1946. He returned to Massachusetts, found work as a machinist, and built a life that did not include stories about Bougainville or Hill 260. His service record listed the Pacific Theater, nothing more. There was no mention of modified ammunition, no reference to red-banded rounds, no explanation for why he had survived engagements that killed others. He never told his family. Orders were orders. Joste meant silence, even after the weapon was destroyed. Even after the men who issued those orders retired or died, Captain Theodore Walsh remained at Aberdeen Proving Ground until his retirement in 1962. His personnel file recorded a long, competent career in ordnance development. Project Thunder did not appear anywhere in it. After declassification in 1980, he was 87 years old. He remembered the project clearly. "We knew it would work," he said. "The question was whether it would work well enough to justify the complications." That was as close as he came to claiming responsibility. Sergeant William Davis, Mitchell's squad leader on Bougainville, stayed in the Marines. He served in Korea, then Vietnam. None of them heard about explosive rifle ammunition. He followed the same rule he had learned in 1944. You don't talk about things that don't officially exist. When a researcher contacted him after declassification, Davis confirmed the ammunition's effectiveness without embellishment. "Good for emergencies," he said. "Not something you want all the time." Many of the Marines who carried the red-banded rounds lived ordinary lives afterward. They worked, they raised families, they attended reunions where stories were told and retold, except for this one. There were no shared memories to compare. No public recognition, no acknowledgement that something unusual had happened. On the other side of the war, the record was even thinner. Few Japanese soldiers who encountered the weapons survived the conflict. Fewer still spoke about it afterward. Post-war Japan focused on rebuilding, not cataloging battlefield anomalies. One reference surfaced decades later in a local history interview in Yokohama, now brief mention of American bullets that exploded. Every round either fired in combat or destroyed after the war. No museum displays, no preserved examples. Perhaps a few empty cartridge cases remain buried in tropical soil, corroding quietly. What remains is data, numbers and reports, casualty tables, mainnet logs, redacted pays that. Young men, 19, 20, 23 years old, handed a magazine marked with tape and told, "Use these." They used them. They survived attacks that should have overwhelmed them, and then they went home and said nothing. For 35 years, silence did its job. The story faded. The weapon became a footnote that no one could find. When the files were finally opened, there was no reckoning, no debate, no sudden reassessment of the Pacific War. The world had moved on. What remains is a quiet truth about innovation under pressure. Captain Walsh did not invent a new explosive or a new rifle. He combined existing parts in a way no one had tried, and gave individual Marines a temporary, overwhelming advantage. It worked too well to keep the men who carried the red bands never asked for recognition. They asked only to survive another night. They did. And when the weapon was erased, they accepted that too. Because in war, survival is remembered privately, and silence sometimes is the last order you obey.